They called him the most dangerous man in the federal prison system. A man who spent 36 years in solitary confinement, longer than any other inmate in U.S. history. He turned steel cages into battlefields and silence into rebellion. From Marion to ADX Florence, every guard knew his name and feared it. But who was Thomas Silverstein, and what truly made him America's most evil inmate? Before we begin, hit subscribe, because what you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's a descent into the darkest cell in America. Thomas Edward Silverstein was born on February 4, 1952, in Long Beach, California, a place far removed from the concrete hells that would later define his name. His childhood wasn't extraordinary, at least not at first glance. Raised in a working-class family, he experienced the kind of instability that quietly shapes broken futures. Divorce, poverty, and the creeping presence of resentment. His mother remarried when he was still young, and that's when the world began to shift for him. Silverstein later claimed that his stepfather was abusive, that his household felt less like a home and more like a pressure cooker. Teachers described him as quiet but defiant, the type of kid who didn't cry when hit, but who'd stare you down afterward. By the time he reached his teens, he had already begun experimenting with petty crime, shoplifting, car theft, and small burglaries. It wasn't about the money, it was about the control. The feeling of taking back something from a world that took from him. In 1971, at just 19, Silverstein was arrested for armed robbery in California. It wasn't the kind of case that drew headlines, just another young man caught in the endless churn of America's justice system. He was sentenced to 15 years and sent to San Quentin State Prison. No one knew that behind those walls, a legend was beginning to form. Inside San Quentin, Silverstein met the prison system's first real university, the Yard. It was there he learned the code: loyalty, violence, silence. San Quentin wasn't just a prison, it was a kingdom ruled by race, gangs, and survival instincts sharper than any blade. Silverstein, young and angry, gravitated toward those who shared his fury. He was white, alone, and surrounded by predators. Protection came with allegiance, and his allegiance soon found its home in one of the most feared groups inside, the Aryan Brotherhood. The Brotherhood, or AB, wasn't just a gang. It was an army forged in the blood-soaked yards of California's toughest prisons. They were organized, disciplined, and merciless. They claimed to be protectors of white inmates, but in truth they were businessmen of death, running drug operations, extortions, and assassinations for power and profit. Silverstein wasn't born violent. The system taught him violence as a second language. By 1977 he was transferred to Leavenworth Penitentiary, one of America's most notorious federal prisons. There he officially became a made member of the Aryan Brotherhood. But it was also where he began his transformation, from another inmate into a symbol of uncontrollable defiance. Prison records from that time describe him as quiet, organized, and cold. He worked out obsessively, avoided unnecessary talk, and studied the structure of the prison like a military officer preparing for war. He saw how guards moved when doors locked and who controlled which corners. He wasn't impulsive, he was patient, and patience in prison is a dangerous thing. According to Bureau of Prisons archives, Silverstein's discipline made him stand out. Unlike most inmates, he didn't seek attention or chaos, he built strategy. But beneath that calm exterior, rage was brewing. It was a rage that would soon erupt and forever change the course of American prison history. By the late 1970s, the federal prison system was a war zone divided by color, creed, and control. Inside Leavenworth, racial lines were drawn in blood. The Aryan Brotherhood, Mexican Mafia, Black Guerrilla Family, and DC Blacks all carved their power into concrete. And in the middle of that chaos, Thomas Silverstein was rising, not as a loudmouth but as a silent tactician. He wasn't the biggest man on the yard, but he was precise, the kind of inmate who made others uneasy just by walking past. He had a calmness that didn't belong in a place built on rage. The Brotherhood noticed it. They saw a soldier with no hesitation and no mercy. And soon they'd use him. In 1980, a major conflict erupted inside Leavenworth between the Aryan Brotherhood and a rival group known as the DC Blacks, a predominantly African-American gang formed for protection against white supremacist violence. The rivalry wasn't new, it had been simmering for years. But this time it boiled over. A DC Blacks member named Robert Chappelle was found dead in his cell, strangled with a cord, his body neatly positioned as if to send a message. The murder stunned prison officials but not the inmates. Whispers spread fast, Silverstein did it. The Bureau of Prisons immediately charged him with Chappelle's murder, claiming it was a targeted killing ordered by the Aryan Brotherhood. Silverstein denied it, but evidence, circumstantial and shaky, painted him as the executioner. Without hard proof, but with enough inmate testimony to satisfy the courts, he was convicted of first-degree murder and given a life sentence without parole. That conviction changed everything. Overnight, Thomas Silverstein became a marked man, both to rival gangs and to the prison administration. Guards began treating him as if he were a living weapon. Transfers followed, tighter security, and eventually isolation. But if the system thought that locking him down would break him, they were wrong. It only focused him. By 1981, Silverstein had been moved to USP Marion in Illinois, a prison designed to replace Alcatraz as the most secure facility in the United States. Marion was built to house the worst of the worst, and Silverstein fit the label perfectly. The place ran on tension. Every hallway hummed with hatred. And in that environment, another conflict was waiting, one that would burn into the history of American corrections forever. Inside Marion, Silverstein met Raymond Cadillac Smith, a reputed leader of the DC Blacks. The two men despised each other. Their rivalry was racial, ideological, and deeply personal. According to court records, Smith taunted Silverstein constantly, calling him a coward, mocking the Brotherhood, and even threatening his life. Guards reportedly laughed it off, believing it was just prison talk. But to Silverstein it was more than talk, it was an insult to his existence. Every insult, every stare, every whisper carved itself deeper into his psyche. And in a world where violence was the only language of power, he decided to respond in the only way that prison respected. On November 22, 1981, Thomas Silverstein and another Aryan Brotherhood member, Clayton Fountain, made their move. According to official reports, the two approached Raymond Smith in the recreation area. What followed lasted just minutes, but the brutality was unlike anything the staff had ever seen. Armed with homemade shanks, Silverstein and Fountain cornered Smith and attacked. It was fast, clinical, and merciless. Guards later said it was like watching a ritual, one that ended only when Smith stopped moving. When it was over, the floor was red and Smith's body was lifeless. The killing was a declaration of war. The Aryan Brotherhood had struck again, and Thomas Silverstein had sealed his name in prison legend. The Bureau of Prisons immediately labeled him as one of the most dangerous inmates in federal custody. But Silverstein didn't see himself as evil. He saw himself as surviving in a system that demanded monsters. He once said in an interview years later, "They say I'm the most dangerous man alive, but they made me this way. They locked me down and expected me not to fight." But the real storm was still ahead. Because in less than 2 years, Silverstein would go from being a dangerous inmate to committing an act that would change how America built prisons forever. By 1983, USP Marion had become a pressure cooker of hatred, fear, and vengeance. The killing of Raymond Cadillac Smith had unleashed chaos inside those concrete walls. Tension between inmates and guards had reached a breaking point, and at the center of it all stood Thomas Silverstein, calm, unflinching, and hated by nearly everyone in uniform. After Smith's murder, the Bureau of Prisons placed Silverstein under no human contact status, a term that would later define his existence for the rest of his life. He was moved to an isolated cell, locked away for 23 hours a day. No cellmate. No conversation. Just silence and the sound of his own breathing echoing through the steel. But inside that silence, something dark was growing. The guards at Marion treated Silverstein like a symbol of defiance, something that had to be broken. And one of them, a veteran correctional officer named Merle Klutz, took that mission personally. Klutz was known for being strict but fair, the kind of officer who followed the rulebook word for word. But with Silverstein, his approach hardened into obsession. According to inmate affidavits, Klutz reportedly monitored Silverstein constantly, taunting him, moving him from cell to cell, confiscating drawings and letters, and reminding him that he would die in a cage. For a man already sentenced to die behind bars, those words weren't just insults, they were challenges. Silverstein believed that Klutz was trying to break him psychologically, and over time, that belief turned into a burning hatred. Then came October 22, 1983, the day the system would change forever. That morning began like any other at Marion. The air was cold, the hallways echoing with the mechanical sound of doors clanging shut. Silverstein was escorted out for his daily shower. His wrists shackled, his ankles chained, a guard's hand gripping the chain that ran through his cuffs. Klutz was part of the escort detail that day. He knew Silverstein and Silverstein knew him. But what neither of them realized was that this would be their final confrontation. As they approached the shower area, another inmate, Clayton Fountain, Silverstein's ally in the earlier killing, was being escorted nearby. Somehow, in an instant that remains disputed to this day, Silverstein slipped his restraints. Some reports suggest another inmate unlocked his cuffs. Others say it was a mistake in procedure. But within seconds, Silverstein had a homemade knife in his hand, a piece of sharpened steel nearly 8 inches long, wrapped with cloth for grip. What happened next was described by witnesses as fast, silent, and horrifying. Silverstein lunged forward and attacked Officer Klutz. The assault was methodical, deliberate. Klutz tried to fight back, but the attack was overwhelming. Within moments he collapsed. Other guards rushed in, but by then it was too late. When the chaos ended, Klutz lay dead on the floor, stabbed repeatedly. Silverstein didn't flee. He didn't beg. He simply placed the shank on the ground, stepped back, and said the words that would echo through the Bureau of Prisons for decades. "No one has control of me anymore." That single act, the murder of a federal correctional officer inside a maximum security prison, sent shockwaves through the country. It was the first time an inmate had openly killed a guard in the most secure prison in the nation. The Bureau of Prisons responded with an unprecedented lockdown. Marion went into permanent 23-hour-a-day isolation, effectively becoming the first supermax prison in the United States. In the weeks that followed, Silverstein was placed in total isolation, deeper than anyone before him. No phone calls. No visits. No contact with any other inmate. Even his meals were passed through a narrow slot. The Bureau of Prisons called it administrative control. Silverstein called it a living tomb. He later said in a letter, "I'm not mad at Klutz for being a guard. I'm mad at the system that pushed us both into that moment." But to the public and to correctional officers across the country, Silverstein became something else, a symbol of absolute evil. News outlets labeled him America's most dangerous inmate. Politicians used his case to demand tougher prison policies. And quietly, the architects of the Bureau began designing a new kind of prison. One built not to rehabilitate but to contain men like him forever. That blueprint would later become ADX Florence, the Alcatraz of the Rockies. For Silverstein, the consequences were final. He was never again allowed to touch another human being. His name was erased from prison population lists and replaced with a number. He had killed a man, yes. But he had also changed how America viewed punishment. After the killing of Officer Klutz, the Bureau of Prisons made a decision that would define the rest of Thomas Silverstein's life. They didn't just punish him, they erased him. No trial. No courtroom drama. No headlines filled with appeals. Just a quiet administrative order that said, in effect, bury him alive. Silverstein was placed under a no human contact order, a special form of confinement that no other prisoner in the federal system had ever received before. The term was literal. No visits, no physical interaction, no conversation with another person. The door to his world was a steel slab with a slot just large enough for food trays to slide through. For 36 years that door barely opened. His new home was a 7 by 12-foot concrete cell inside the most secure unit of the federal prison system, a place built specifically for him. The cell contained a bed bolted to the floor, a toilet, a sink, and a small desk made of concrete. The light stayed on 24 hours a day. There were no bars to look through, no window to the outside world, only a small, thick piece of reinforced glass that allowed in a dull gray glow. Every day was the same. Wake up. Stretch in silence. Eat alone. Read alone. Sleep and dream of freedom he would never touch again. To keep from losing his mind, Silverstein built a routine. He drew sketches, practiced yoga, wrote letters, and painted. His artwork, surreal, haunting, and often filled with prison imagery, eventually made its way outside through supporters who mailed his drawings to advocacy groups. The art world called it outsider art. He called it proof I'm still human. But the Bureau of Prisons wasn't interested in his art, only in his containment. They built layers of security around him. Soundproof walls, motion sensors, and multiple locked doors separating his cell from any other inmate. Guards were instructed to avoid unnecessary conversation. Some wore mirrored sunglasses to prevent eye contact. He became a ghost, alive but socially dead. Over time, Silverstein began to feel the psychological weight of that existence. In letters later obtained by journalists, he described hallucinations, memory loss, and a sensation of his mind melting. He said he sometimes forgot what people's voices sounded like. The silence was so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat echo through the room. In a 2007 letter, he wrote, "I've lived in a tomb for so long I feel like I've become part of the concrete. The walls talk to me now. The silence screams." Human rights organizations began taking notice. The ACLU, Human Rights Watch, and even former wardens spoke out, arguing that Silverstein's confinement was a violation of the Eighth Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment. A federal lawsuit was filed on his behalf, Silverstein versus Federal Bureau of Prisons, claiming that his decades in solitary were destroying his mind. But the Bureau defended its decision. They called him an exceptional case. They argued that no other inmate posed a greater risk to safety, that if anyone had earned isolation, it was him. The courts sided with the Bureau. And so year after year, the man once feared by everyone faded into the quiet rhythm of his own captivity. In the 1990s, as ADX Florence, the new Supermax, opened in Colorado, Silverstein was transferred there. Ironically, the prison had been designed largely because of him. Officials believed no single human being should ever again be able to do what he did at Marion. Inside ADX, Silverstein's conditions barely changed. He remained under the same no-contact order. His cell was larger, but the isolation was the same, a slightly bigger tomb. From that point forward, he existed as a relic of an era when the government learned that control could be total. In interviews conducted through letters, Silverstein insisted he was not the monster people thought he was. He claimed he'd acted in self-defense, in a system where guards provoked violence and then punished inmates for reacting. He wrote about meditation, forgiveness, and the cruelty of being forgotten. They say prison is for rehabilitation, he wrote. But you can't rehabilitate a man you've buried alive. Even some prison officers began questioning the morality of it. One retired warden told The Guardian, "You can't keep a man in a box for decades and still call yourself civilized." Still, Silverstein endured. He trained his mind to live in silence, counting steps, memorizing shadows, timing his heartbeats, and imagining distant oceans he'd never see again. When asked once if he feared death, he replied, "No. I've already died a long time ago. This is just what's left walking." Thomas Silverstein would spend 36 continuous years in solitary confinement, the longest in American history. He became both a warning and a question mark in the debate over punishment. How far can justice go before it becomes cruelty? But the story of Silverstein's tomb didn't end there. Because even inside that silence he found a strange kind of awakening, a spiritual transformation that no one expected. By the mid-1990s, Thomas Silverstein had already become an urban legend among prison guards. A name whispered in correctional academies, a cautionary tale for rookies about how far rebellion could go. But inside the walls of ADX Florence, the Alcatraz of the Rockies, Silverstein's existence took on a strange, almost mystical turn. The man once branded America's most evil inmate began to live more like a monk than a murderer. The transition didn't happen overnight. 4 years after his transfer, Silverstein was consumed by bitterness. Every clang of the steel door was a reminder of betrayal, by the system, by his gang, even by himself. But eventually rage exhausted itself. There was nowhere for it to go inside a 7 by 12-foot box. What remained was silence. And in that silence, something unexpected grew. Silverstein began to meditate. He discovered Eastern philosophy through prison library requests, mostly worn-out paperbacks passed through the food slot. Titles like Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, and the Tao of Inner Peace. He read them repeatedly, sometimes copying entire chapters by hand. In one letter to a journalist he wrote, "I can't change where I am, but I can change who I am in here." He turned his daily routine into ritual. Every morning at 5 a.m. he'd sit cross-legged on the cold concrete, close his eyes and breathe. 4 hours he'd visualize himself outside, walking barefoot through sand, touching grass, feeling sunlight on his face. Guards passing by often saw him sitting motionless, eyes closed, hands resting calmly on his knees. To them it looked like madness. To Silverstein it was survival. He even built a small temple inside his cell, a row of folded papers and hand-drawn mandalas taped to the wall. Using pencils and coffee grounds as paint, he began creating elaborate sketches of Buddhist imagery mixed with prison symbols. Barbed wire transforming into lotus petals, skulls dissolving into clouds, locked doors opening into beams of light. Through his artwork, Silverstein reached the outside world again. Prisoner rights groups began publishing his letters and art on websites dedicated to exposing solitary confinement. Some of his pieces sold at charity auctions, raising funds for advocacy campaigns. Critics called it redemption art. Others called it manipulation. But the drawings spoke for themselves, intricate, emotional, and full of the humanity the Bureau tried to erase. In 2007, one of his letters was published publicly. Read, "They took away my freedom, my touch, my sky. But they couldn't take my mind. So I built a new world in my head, one with no bars. Even guards who despised him began to notice the change. He no longer argued, no longer lashed out, no longer carried the coiled tension of a predator. Instead, he greeted officers calmly and thanked them for delivering his food. To some, it was disarming. To others, it was eerie, like a man who had accepted his death and was just waiting for it to finish. Psychologists who studied long-term solitary confinement later referenced Silverstein's case as an example of spiritual dissociation, when isolation pushes a mind so deep inward that it builds a universe to survive. He wasn't sane in the normal sense, but he had constructed a private peace, fragile as glass. Yet even as he found moments of serenity, he remained critical of the system that created him. In letters to the ACLU and Solitary Watch, he described ADX as a place where men go to disappear. He detailed how other prisoners screamed through the vents at night, the only form of communication left. "I hear them crying, praying, losing themselves," he wrote. "You can't cage people like this forever without killing something in them." His words began circulating among activists and journalists, sparking new debate about the ethics of supermax prisons. To reformers, Silverstein had become a living example of what happens when punishment turns into psychological torture. To prison officials, he was still a murderer, one who could never be trusted again. The irony was undeniable. The man who once ruled the most feared white supremacist faction in federal custody was now writing about compassion, suffering, and forgiveness. In 2010, a psychologist who reviewed his case noted, "Mr. Silverstein shows no current signs of violent intent. His reality is structured entirely around internal control, a kind of prison within a prison." But it didn't matter. The Bureau refused to lift his no-contact order. He would die in isolation no matter how peaceful he had become. Even then, Silverstein continued creating. He wrote essays on prison ethics, exchanged letters with artists, and encouraged other inmates, through heavily censored correspondence, to draw, write, and meditate. To some, he was still a killer. To others, he had become the monk of the whole, a paradox of violence and enlightenment, a man who turned his tomb into a shrine. When asked once if he still felt anger toward the system, he replied, "Yes, but it's not the kind that burns. It's the kind that understands." That was perhaps his greatest transformation, from hate to understanding, even inside the most inhuman conditions imaginable. But time, like the concrete that surrounded him, eventually wore everything down. And as Silverstein grew older, his body began to fail him. The next chapter of his life would be his last, one that ended, fittingly, in silence. On May 11, 2019, at the age of 67, Thomas Silverstein took his final breath, not inside the cold cell that had entombed him for decades, but in a hospital bed in Pueblo, Colorado. He died from complications of heart surgery after being transferred from ADX Florence, the fortress built to contain men like him. There were no vigils, no statements from the Bureau of Prisons, no public mourning. His death was as quiet as the life he had been forced to live, sealed off, distant, and largely forgotten by the world outside. After 36 years in solitary confinement, the longest in American history, the man once branded the most dangerous prisoner alive, left behind a legacy that was both horrifying and haunting. To some, he remained the monster who had murdered a correctional officer in cold blood. To others, he became a symbol, a mirror reflecting the cruelty and futility of a system that punishes until there's nothing left to destroy. Even after his death, his name continued to echo in debates about the ethics of solitary confinement, prison reform, and human rights. Lawmakers and advocates cited his case as proof that extreme isolation doesn't correct violence. It breeds madness and despair. In letters discovered after his death, Silverstein himself wrote, "If I had been treated like a human being, I might have become one sooner." It's a line that still divides opinion. Was he expressing regret or condemnation? Perhaps both. His ashes were reportedly claimed by his family, quietly, without ceremony. The concrete cell that once held him remains empty, a relic of a man who lived longer in isolation than anyone before him. A man who forced the Bureau of Prisons to reinvent the very concept of control. A man whose shadow still lingers in the corridors of every supermax cell in America. Whether you see Thomas Silverstein as a monster, a martyr, or a mirror of America's darkest system, one truth remains: he was a product of the machine he fought. His story is not just about one man, it's about what happens when power and punishment go too far. And so the door finally closes on the man they called America's most evil inmate. A man who entered prison a criminal, and left it as a ghost. Before you go, if you found this story eye-opening, Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next deep dive into America's hidden prisons. Because every shadow has a story, and we're here to bring them into the light.